For our first example, we're going to take a look at a simple C# application that displays Welcome to C# programming in a command prompt window. Now, before I get into the project, which is actually already open over here in Visual Studio, I just want to talk briefly about the folder structure that you're going to see from this point out as you look at the example code for this lesson and subsequent lessons as well. So as you can see here, we're inside of my user accounts documents folder, which is where I'm assuming that you've placed our examples folder that contains all of the examples that go along with these videos and also along with our books, Visual C#, How to Program 6th edition, and C# for Programmers 6th edition as well. Now, we're working with the examples in this lesson from Chapter 3 of those books, and specifically I'm using the examples from the Visual C# How to Program College textbook, which is our book for C# that's geared towards non-programmers. However, the source code for these examples is the same in the C# for Programmers book. So if you are indeed following along with one of our books, the figure numbers are going to match precisely with our How to Program textbook. They may not match exactly when you're in the For Programmers book, but the source code itself will. Now, as you can see, I've already opened up in the background here the first project that we're going to look at, but just navigating into the folder that we access that from, you can see there's a Welcome 1 subfolder, which happens to be the name of our project, and within that you can see there's a solution file .sln, which is what you open up to open the project itself inside of Visual Studio. So I already opened that up by double-clicking the .sln file, and the reason I did that in advance is it just saves me a little time during my video recordings. Now, the one other thing I want to point out here is that by default the file name extensions do not get displayed. So if you would like to see file name extensions like I'm showing here, you can go to the View tab and simply check off file name extensions, and that way you can see the type of every file, not just by looking at its icon, which helps you understand the type of the file sometimes, but also by looking at its file name extension. So let's go ahead over to Visual Studio now, and one of the things that I like to do first before I get into the source code for any example is show you that example in action. Now clearly this is a very basic program, and when I go ahead and run it, which I'm going to do initially by clicking the Start button here on the toolbar, you'll see a window pop up quickly and disappear quickly as well. The program actually just ran, but when you run using this Start button, it runs the program in what's known as debug mode. And in debug mode, once the program terminates, the window in which the program was running goes away immediately, unless you have put what are known as breakpoints into the code so that you can kind of step through your program and see how it's executing. So the way that I'm going to ask you to run the programs as I do here is by typing Control and the F5 key. When I do that, it brings open a command prompt window. As you can see here, it's taking up most of my screen at the moment. And within that command prompt window is the result of the program, Welcome to C# Programming with an exclamation point. And when you run with Control F5 for these so-called console applications, it automatically displays the text, press any key to continue. And when you press a key on the keyboard, then that window will be dismissed. So always run your programs if you want to see the results staying on the screen with Control F5, or you could also run in debug mode and simply step your way through the program as well. And I will demonstrate that in various cases throughout these videos. Now, we have just a few lines of code overall here, 12 total lines of code, and on many of those lines we have comments. These are single line comments in C#. Single line comments start with 2 / characters, and everything to the right of those characters is ignored by the compiler. And as you can see down here in line 11 and line 12, the single line comment does not need to start at the beginning of the line. So in this case we're using ending comments on these closing curly braces, which we'll discuss in a few moments, just to indicate where the end of the so-called method main is, and also where the end of our class welcome1 is as well. And we'll only use comments like that here in lesson 3. As we move on to subsequent lessons, we won't have any more of those end comments. Now, it turns out C# has several other forms of comments. You have the C style, slash asterisk, asterisk, slash style comment. This is known as a multi-line comment. Everything between these two delimiters is ignored by the compiler. And there are two other forms of comment as well. There is a triple slash comment, which, as you see, once I typed the third slash, automatically inserted some additional comment code. These are so-called documentation comments, and when you have a documentation comment, that information can actually be used to generate HTML-based documentation for your code. And finally, there's also another form of documentation comment, which is slash asterisk asterisk and asterisk slash to terminate it. And this too is a documentation comment. It's just a multi-line comment, whereas the triple forward slash is a bunch of individual single line documentation comments. So you do have a number of different comment syntaxes that you can use in a C# program, and throughout all of our examples we will be sticking with the simple single line comments. Next, we're going to take a look at the using directive that you see here at line 3. Now, when you build a C# application, of course you'll work with lots of code that you write yourself, but you're also going to work with a tremendous amount of code that comes from various so-called class libraries. And the primary class library that you're going to be working with when you use C# for programming on Windows is the .NET Framework class library. Now, the .NET Framework class library contains literally thousands of predefined types, and within them thousands upon thousands of capabilities that you can take advantage of in your programs. And one such capability is the ability to write text into a command prompt window, which we can do via the so-called console class. Now, you notice as I hover over console here that a tooltip pops up saying that this is a class named system.console. It turns out that the console class is in what's known as the system namespace, and as I hover over that, you see another tooltip pop up on the screen saying namespace system. And anytime you're going to take advantage of a class that you don't define, but rather that comes from a pre-existing class library, you need a using directive specifying the namespace from which that class is going to come, from where it's defined. And that basically tells the compiler, when you come across a name that you don't understand, look in that namespace to see if there's a definition for that name in that namespace. So because console is from the system namespace, the compiler will look there to locate the definition of class console and check to make sure that we're using it correctly in our code. Now, it turns out that there's literally dozens upon dozens of pre-existing namespaces containing thousands upon thousands of pre-existing types, and it's really hard to get a handle on the sheer volume of information that's out there and the set of capabilities that you have available to you. So one of the things that I'm going to recommend is that you spend a good amount of time with the .NET Framework documentation. So here I've gone ahead already and pulled up the documentation for the .NET Framework class library. You can see the URL here at the top of the screen. And if I go ahead and zoom back out again here, if I scroll down on the page, you'll see that one of the links is to the Framework class library. And within that, we will have a list of all of the namespaces that are available to us. Now, as I scroll here, I just want to show you that there are many, many namespaces for you to work with. And once you know that you have a type from a particular namespace, you can then navigate into that namespace to learn more about it. So if I scroll back up here, there's my system namespace, and as I just mentioned, we're going to be using the console class from that namespace. So you can see here in the documentation for the system namespace, there's a table of classes, and if I scroll down in here, you'll eventually get to the console class. And if you now want to learn more about it, there's a brief description of it over here on the right hand side, but I can also navigate directly to that class in the documentation and get a more detailed introduction to the class. If I scroll down, you'll see various capabilities that the class provides, and you'll see that there's quite a number of them. And of course, for any one of those capabilities, these are all links that allow you to learn more about that particular capability. So you need to spend time with the documentation to get a full understanding of the capabilities of any type, any class that you're going to use. Otherwise, you may not know rather that there are pre-existing capabilities that you can take advantage of, and you may wind up trying to reinvent the wheel. So definitely a good idea to take a look at that documentation. Now going back over here, when you have a using directive, this using keyword is a keyword and must be spelled with all lowercase letters. So for example, if I put an uppercase letter here, now all of a sudden I have red squiggly lines indicating that something's wrong in my code. So basically the IDE is compiling the code in the background as you write it, which can also help make you more efficient because you eliminate errors as they occur. Also, the name system is case sensitive. C# as a language is case sensitive, so it has to be system with a capital S in order to properly say that you're using the system namespace. Next, we're going to take a look at the class named Welcome1. Now, we're working here with, again, what's called a console application that outputs text into the command prompt window, and as you'll see later on in this lesson, the user can also type information into that window to submit it into the program. Now, when you're working with a console application, your program is always going to consist of at least one class definition. So we have a class called Welcome1, and you could have multiple classes, as we'll see starting with the next lesson, but in this case we have just the one class called Welcome1, and the other key feature is that the class must contain a method named main, which is the entry point into the application. But let's for the moment focus on the class itself. Every class you create starts with the keyword class and has a class name, which is an identifier that starts with a capital first letter and uses what we call the Pascal case naming convention. It comes from the language, the programming language called Pascal, and basically in that naming convention you start each identifier for a class name with a capital first letter, and if you have multiple words in the name, each subsequent word also has a capital first letter. In this particular case, we have the identifier Welcome1, and that's because we have several welcome examples over the next several videos, and Welcome1 is just the first of those, and we'll increase the number as we go to the next class definition in a subsequent example. Now, every class you create has a body, which is delimited by a set of curly braces, an opening left curly brace here on line 6, and a closing right curly brace down here at line 12. And the convention in C# is to vertically align those curly braces and indent within those curly braces everything that makes up the body of that class. The last piece of our example is the main method that you see here at lines 8 through 11. And as you'll learn in subsequent lessons, there's actually 4 different ways that this line can appear in your code. However, the vast majority of our examples that are these console applications will use the version of main that you see here starting at line 8. Now, the static keyword is required for main, and that's something that I'll talk about in more detail a few lessons down the line. But main is again the entry point to your application. The method name starts with a capital first letter, and that's required because the .NET runtime expects there to be that main method as the entry point. And if you name it incorrectly, even with a lowercase letter, then the runtime won't be able to find that method and call it to perform its task. So main in this case returns nothing, which is why we have the void keyword to the left of main. And the empty parentheses to the right of main simply indicate that main, quote unquote, takes no parameters, meaning it does not need any data to help it perform its task. Now, any method you define is typically going to have a body, also delimited by braces like the braces of the class definition. And I say typically because in C# there's a new concept called an expression-bodied method that uses a slightly different syntax, and we'll see that when we get to the lesson on methods subsequently in these live lessons videos. Now, within the curly braces of the body of main are one or more statements that say what main is going to do as it's executing. And in this case, at line 10, we have one statement. And as you can see, the statement ends with a semicolon. This particular statement is going to use a feature from the console class, which is a method named WriteLine. So WriteLine belongs to the console class, and as you can see here, we access the WriteLine method with the member access operator, the dot operator as it's called. So console.WriteLine says to the console class, I want to invoke your WriteLine method. And the WriteLine method in this case is receiving as an argument what's known as a string literal. Anytime you have a double quoted set of characters, as we do here, that's a string literal. And literal meaning what you see is what's going to actually be displayed in the console. Now, it turns out there are also special characters that you can insert into string literals, but we don't have any of those special characters here that will appear differently when they're actually output from the program. So the string literal, when it gets output, is displayed without the delimiting double quote characters. So the double quotes help you delimit the string within your code, but they don't appear in the programming output unless you explicitly insert a special way of displaying a double quote character as part of the string literal, and I'll talk about that as well in a subsequent example. So console.WriteLine is going to tell the console class to write out a line of text to the command prompt window, and after it finishes displaying the characters in this string literal, it will automatically position the cursor on the screen to the beginning of the next line. So when I run this program once again and bring up the console window, you see welcome to C# programming exclamation point. That's the contents of my string literal. Then WriteLine automatically moved the cursor down to the beginning of this line. And remember, when you type Control F5 to run, the IDE automatically inserts press any key to continue ... and now as soon as I press a key, that window will be dismissed. So that's our first example here in C#, and in the next video I will show you how to build this application from scratch.